very much. So I've been given the slot where everybody's food coma is starting to kick in. So hopefully I'll make things a little bit, we've got some good demos and things in this presentation that will hopefully wake people up a little bit. Before I get started, as was mentioned, I head up a team called the Forward Looking Threat Research Team at Trend Micro. So we do the technology research, any e-crimes investigations. So if you've ever seen any arrests with Trend Micro mentioned in the title, that's kind of our team as well that we work on. Before I get started talking about ICS and Scada, I wanted to show a Twitter exchange from about 6 months ago that I thought I should put up here, explaining that I would present for food and was promised crisps, which Brian I have not received yet, so I'm expecting some potato, cheese and onions to turn up at some point. But to start explaining first of all, what is ICS and what is Scada, right? So ICS stands for Industrial Control System, and Scada stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition, which is essentially a type of ICS system. So what these are is programmable devices, smart devices, whatever you want to call them, that control everything around the world from car manufacturing to water plants to nuclear facilities like Springfield in this case. And up until about 2010, nobody really cared about ICS security. So if we look at a Google Trends graph here, you can see nobody cares, and something happens in 2010. Suddenly everybody cares about ICS security, and now you've got people, if you go on to LinkedIn, you have ICS security evangelists. That's actually a job title that people have. So what happened in June 2010? Well, simply put, June 2010 was when Stuxnet malware was discovered, which allegedly targeted this facility in Iran, Natanz plant. So I'm not going to get up here and talk about Stuxnet, but of course I did have to say it at least once. This is an ICS talk, you have to mention the word Stuxnet. But what Stuxnet did, as well as obviously hacking this particular place in Iran, was it raised the awareness for people of what is going on out there in terms of targeted attacks at kind of state level. It also changed how certain states, how they actually portray themselves. So up until this point, if you read most of the stuff from the US before Stuxnet came out, it's all around, oh, we should set up a cyber command unit. We don't know which wing of the army we're going to put it under. Is it going to be Army? Is it going to be Air Force? Is it going to be Navy? And of course, they were doing this for a long, long time and are actually quite good at it. And you've got other nations, it's now become more common knowledge that, look, nations are kind of doing this stuff to each other. But it also, for the media, was great because they found two new buzzwords, ICS and Scada, that they'd never heard of before and didn't understand, and to a large degree still don't understand, but that they could put them into, papers, and it just sold because it's James Bond type stuff. Of course, they also, the other buzzword that I have to mention as part of a presentation is cyber. So if you put cyber in front of anything, that also makes it cooler and sexier. In fact, if you're already bored of my presentation and you want to kind of make things a little more interesting for yourself, feel free to try and, if you've got drink with you, take a shot every time I say the word cyber. There's a hospital not a million miles from here, so you should be okay. So just to give some recent coverage in the media of using the word cyber, we have the biggest cyber attack in history, right? I have no idea what a girl smashing glass has to do with cyber attacks, but that's what they use. So we've got cyber attacks. We have cyber strikes between countries on each other. We have cyber offensives. We have, of course, got cyber war. We have to have cyber war. Cyber Pearl Harbor, which makes no sense. Cyber 9/11, which makes even less sense. And then, of course, the almighty cyber Armageddon will soon be upon us, right? So cyber is just one of these buzzwords, like ICS and Scada a little bit. But what I'm going to talk about, or what I want to talk about for the next half hour, is what are these systems? We hear that ICS systems and Scada systems are just connected to the internet and not secured and so on. Surely it can't be that easy for attackers. Well, in fact, it actually is. So I'm going to show some demos of how an attacker can find an ICS system with pretty much ease. And the first tool that is available to attackers, which is a really, really powerful tool for finding any of these sort of systems, is called Google, or Bing for anybody from Microsoft in the room. To be fair, If you're looking for SCADA systems, Bing is better than Google, because Bing has some nice advanced operators where you can search by IP addresses and network blocks and so on, which actually makes your life a little bit easier. But it's still, you know, it's fun to beat up on Microsoft and Bing, so I'm allowed to do that. So let me show you some demos and show you exactly how easy it is to actually find some of these systems. So, see here, open up Chrome. Hopefully this still works. Excellent, everyone can see. So by using some simple searches, I can very quickly find actual connected systems, like this one, in URL meter information. So this is just looking for devices which are connected to the internet with the word meter information in the actual URL. If I go down here, these ones, anytime you see something with just an IP address and then web pages hanging off it, that's much more interesting for attackers. Because this isn't a domain that somebody registered and knows is on the internet. This is something that somebody thought, well, Google will never index my system, so it's safe. And if I click on this one, go in, you can see this is it's called a Nexus 1272, which is just a little device that looks like this. I'll show you here. It's a little energy monitor that you would have not in your home, but you would have it in like factories and so on. And you can see here, we can see all the meter information, how long it's been running, the IP address internally, all of that information which you probably don't want to give out to people. If I go back to the main system itself, you can see here it's Gouge Tech is the company that make this particular device. Of course, I can go and look at like volts used, energy readings, all of that sort of stuff. Under Tools, there's a particularly worrying link, which is firmware upgrade. If you click that, luckily, it does give you a login and password is needed to actually do a firmware upgrade on somebody else's system. Unfortunately, and I'm not going to do it here, obviously, but the username and password, if you do a quick Google for Gouge Tech and this device, you will find there is a default username and password, of course. Nobody changes them on anything, so it is very trivial for an attacker to actually gain control of this system. But that's just using something like Google. There's more powerful tools that somebody can use if they want to find ICS systems. And one of the most well-known ones is called Scada. So, whereas you can think of Google and Bing as indexing web pages. They go to web pages, they look at the content, the human readable text, and they index that for you. What Shodan does, if you're not familiar with it, and a lot of you in the room will be familiar with it, Shodan indexes computers, essentially. So it connects to a bunch of different ports on pretty much every computer that's publicly accessible on the internet. So ports like FTP and of course port 80 and other ones as well. It then, the headers that come back that tell you, what version of FTP it is or what's running on that port, they save all down in a database, and that is what you're querying against. So you can look for different systems very quickly with this. So it gives some examples of ones that I've looked at in the past. If I look for port, so I'm searching here for any devices that had port 161 open and had the text Simatic, S-I-M-A-T-I-C, in the response. So let me see, does this work, or has my internet connection gone? Damn it. So that didn't work. Let me see here. Or did I spell it wrong? If not, I'll give a different example. So what this is doing is or should have shown, is any device with port 161 open, here we go, and Simatic in the title. And you see a lot of Siemens Simatic devices. So Siemens, Simatic.net. If I go down through them, you see a lot of these devices are actually using something called Step 7, which is the same architecture that is used in the Stuxnet case, that the Stuxnet malware is written against. And very quickly I can find, in this case, 87 in the US, 18 in Germany and so on, of these systems that are accessible on the internet. Now, most of them will have logins and passwords and stuff like that you would need to know. But the reason I give this example is there's a known vulnerability for Simatic systems. If you just Google Simatic, you'll find there's a denial of service vulnerability, and an attacker can simply go to this site, find stuff with the Shodan, and then go and take most of these systems offline. Or if we want an Irish example, because you can do country codes. So if I do country.ie, I'm going to look at IQ3, which is it's a Dutch company that make heating controls. So just let that search run. It's a little bit slow because, as I said, I'm going over my phone here. And we can see in Ireland 23 devices, all with this particular heating control in place. If I scroll down, you've got interesting names like West Plant Room address. Here's a national school. in Sligo.
The Clyde course on that. It's the Clyde course on that. Just
yeah, actually, if anyone knows the IP address for this room, because it is really warm in here. So, but you can see here is an admin panel up in the top. It says it's national school. Of course, you can get information like alarms. You know, so there was a building fire alarm happened at the primary school back in May 20th. Probably don't want that information on the internet. What's worse is if you go to modules here, and this is just one example of lots. There's a bunch of modules down the side, but if I go to something like, you know, you click through some modules, it's like, okay, it tells me functions and outside air temperature and so on. When you click on them, there's edit boxes. Now, edit boxes only exist if you can change the system. So I'm not going to do that, obviously, but if I change those settings and click the little tick box down the bottom, we're controlling, in this case, a heating facility at a primary school somewhere. It's that trivial for attackers to do this stuff. And it's not just Ireland, of course, every country has this problem. And then another one that came up when we were doing our own research and trying to micro into this is we found this particular one, which is very interesting. So this is a water plant located in Thailand. Ang Mo Kio is a small town, or well, big town by Irish standards, small town by Thai standards. And you can see here that it's a really crappy looking web page, to be fair. But most of these systems, when you start looking at ICS systems that are connected to the internet, they don't look terribly impressive because they were built by an IT guy in 5 minutes to make his life easier. So he can connect to the system from home and doesn't have to go in and fix them and so on. So on this system, you can even see it says, this is a production unit making changes will violate the integrity of the water monitoring system. So basically, please don't mess with this system or you will break things. If we look, there's like diagnostics. Of course, here is submitting changes may adversely affect systems. So I'm not going to do that. You can see the protocols that it supports. So you can connect to it over lovely secure things like Telnet and FTP and so on. Modbus, if you're not familiar with it, is a protocol very commonly used in industrial control systems for kind of control of PLCs and so on. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then there's the HMI, which is the human machine interface for this water plant, which is using some software called Scada BR. Scada BR is an open source software for controlling Scada type systems, right? So it's very commonly deployed. You don't see it so much in like nuclear settings, but in water plants and so on, this is something that you'll come up against fairly often. And again, if you did a quick Google, you will find that Scada BR has a default login and password. So to show you, admin and guess for the password, admin. Press enter. And hey presto, right, it's a water plant, right? So up the top here you have, you know, reports and you have all sorts of like gadgets to see what's going on in the water plant. But what's more worrying, if I go to event handlers, so how an ICS system tends to work is you don't normally make changes and they instantly happen on the plant because there's a lot of programmable devices and so on. So you normally put events into a system. The programmable logic controllers dial back essentially maybe once every hour or so on and see have the new update to do, and then that gets applied. So if I look under system events, the type of things that sysadmin can do here, there's system shutdown. So in the case of system shutdown, let me show you here, this is going to send an email in this case. So yeah, send an email once the system shutdown happens and actually shut down the system. Let's leave the one for a minute, don't worry, do know what I'm doing here. So let's just do test.test.com, add that, and then click save. So this isn't going to shut down the power plant, that's not how these systems work. It created essentially a job that you then have to schedule. So you go to scheduled events, and then here, under add new scheduled event, I simply put in the alias that I used before, which is 1. You set the alarm level, as in, do you want to set off alarms when this goes down? If you're an attacker, probably not. So we'll leave that at none. You can see you can schedule the time and so on, or you can just say have it run hourly. So if I click hourly and click save, now we have a scheduled event, which is going to run every single hour. Every hour this system, this water plant, will shut down. PLCs will dial back in, get this information, and shut down. So I'll come back to that in a minute, because I do have 45 minutes to stop that before something bad happens. So let's go back to the slides for a little bit. And don't worry too much about the people in Thailand. I will stop it before bad things happen. So let me see. Okay. So moving on, before I talk more about that particular case, I want to explain a little bit more about how Scada network tends to look like in reality. So you normally have at the top of your corporate network, that's where your laptops and Outlook and people using Word and all that sort of stuff are. Then you normally have what's called a data historian, which is normally in the demilitarized zone, part of the network. A data historian is essentially, to put it in basic terms, it's a log server. It's where all the logs from all the devices will report back to the data historian, which is like a big log file server, and then the admins can kind of look for, do data correlation, sees anything weird going on. Then you will have the control center. That's where the admins tend to sit. So they're going to sit on workstations, they've got their servers and so on are going to be there. And then at the individual substations, so that could be a water plant, nuclear facility, car manufacturing, whatever it is, you have two types of devices. The first one is called an IED. For anybody in the room with a .mil in your email account, don't worry, that is not an improvised explosive. That stands for Intelligent Electronic Device, so essentially your PLC, the part that is going to control something mechanical in the real world. And then you have RTUs, which are remote terminals. Therefore, if somebody is actively on the site, they also can log into the PLC there and they can make changes, as well as somebody remotely. And then most of the actual commands that are being sent back and forth to these PLC devices are over two protocols. One is called Modbus, and the other one is DNP3. Those are the two standard ones that you tend to see a lot in ICS environments. As you can guess, both of those protocols were designed well before security was ever thought of. They have no authentication built in whatsoever. There is no encryption built into them whatsoever, and both of them have numerous vulnerabilities that have been disclosed for them recently, especially since Stuxnet came out. So really not a secure way to be controlling devices that potentially affect people's lives. But going back for a minute to the water plant that I showed you in Thailand. So we did a longer investigation where we looked more into it. We found that that same water plant setup, that the organization that set it up actually have the exact same setup for water plants in other parts of the world. So we found there was water plants in the US, Brazil, Ireland, Russia, China, Japan and Australia, configured the exact same way, the exact same setup for this purpose. And we know that every single one of those water plants was successfully hacked by attackers. And that in all cases, the attackers exfiltrated data from the water plants. They made changes to each of the water plants, so they configured things, they changed settings and so on. And they basically had access to them for several months at a time, exfiltrating data and moving around the networks and so on. And the reason we know all of that is because those seven water plants around the world are actually all being run from one of my team's basements. So it's entirely fake, right? Which also means that nobody in Thailand is about to lose their water in 5 minutes. So what we did was we have two people on my team who are from the industrial control sector. So one of them used to work for the ICS CERT in the US. The other one was head of security for an energy company, again in the US. So they took a whole bunch of actual real Siemens equipment, so real Siemens PLCs, some of which they had literally just a line, in their basement, and some of which we bought on eBay or we bought them. So we then connected those up using some things like Raspberry Pis and Arduinos and so on, and we built honeypots. So we built Scada honeypots that looked as real as a real water plant would. And to the point where I gave out to the guys saying, nobody's going to fall for that web page that looks really, really bad, and said, trust me, they've done a lot of pen tests on real water plants, and that's exactly how bad they look. So we had to actually dumb it down to make it look as bad as a water plant would be. We also chose water plant because they tend to be a bit less secure than a nuclear power plant. And also for putting them, we wanted to put them in different locations around the world. Everywhere has water plants, not every country has nuclear power plants. So just to show the actual setup that we had, and we ran this for about 5 months. So the components we used Scada BR for an open source Scada management tool, which is commonly used in the industry, so we made use of that. We had real Siemens equipment. We had Arduino and Raspberry Pi for the hardware that we tried to simulate, or succeeded in simulating. The little link here, these are signatures for Snort from a company called QuickDraw, who make Snort signatures for ICS attacks, so we had that running. We also had malware collection with Dianea, which is another honeypot, and we used a tool called Beef, which is the browser exploit framework. Just to clarify on Beef itself, so if you're not familiar with Beef, this is the admin panel for it. Beef is an incredibly powerful pen testing tool, or hacking tool, depending which way you want to look at it, that can give all sorts of access to somebody's machine if they just access they access your machine through a browser, you can do all sorts of stuff to them. In our case, we had no intention of hacking back. All we were using Beef for was more accurate profiling of the people connecting to our honeypots. So instead of just having an IP address, which would normally be behind some proxy somewhere or over Tor, we also would run some of the plugins here, one to detect if Tor was being used, one to get the real internal IP address, and also system information, browser information, and so on, so that we could accurately tell where is this person who is attacking our honeypot coming from. So, to give a summary, overall, we ran these honeypots for about 5 months. We had 32,000 attacks against them during that time. Most of them were kind of low-level attacks. They were just port scans of the internet and so on. So we didn't really classify them as attacks on us. It was just people trying to attack anything that was on the internet. So we had 74 actual attacks. And by that I mean people did reconnaissance, they tried to gain access and so on. And we split them down by where the attacks came from. And this isn't based on GeoIP, this is based on the extra information we got from Beef as well. So this is more than likely where these people actually came from. So you can see most of it by far came from Russia, but you also see, for example, China, Germany, UK, friendly, nice countries like that, were doing a lot of these attacks as well. So what we next did is we took all the attacks, the 74 of them, and we split them into 2 categories, critical attacks and non-critical attacks. So a critical attack is one where if it had been a real water plant, something would have been damaged. Essentially, the plant would have been taken offline, settings were changed, that sort of stuff. Whereas non-critical is they gain access, they exfiltrated data, they moved around our fake networks, but they didn't do anything that would endanger lives. So when you split that down, on the non-critical side, it's still Russia winning, so well done Russia. But you can see that Germany and USA in particular are also not too far, or they're the next 2 biggest. On the critical attacks, most of it came from China. So half of it, in fact, came from China. But you do still see critical attacks coming from Germany, UK, France, Palestine, which is most likely Israel, just the GeoIP was a bit off. And overall, these are pretty interesting for us. So it's not just the kind of big suspects that you would have expected, from the media to be doing these attacks, it's also other countries. What's more interesting is looking at who attacked who. So, because we have these honeypots in 7 different countries around the world, we could see, who's attacking the Russian one, or who's attacking the US one. So we got, apologies, I know you can't read this, but I'll have the slides available afterwards, but our marketing kind of came up with this fancy diagram, very war games-like. So you can see that by far the most attacked place was Russia. So Russia was being attacked by everybody. To the point where there's actually an interesting, this loop here, so the yellow ones are non-critical attacks, red is critical attacks. 45 of the attacks against Russia came from Russia. So now that could either be they have a good Scada cert that is testing themselves, they're testing all of their own systems, or it's also Russia, it could be criminals committing blackmail type attacks. I've got control of your water plant, pay us X amount of money, otherwise no water for you, that type of thing. On the critical side, you can see while most of the critical attacks came out of China, they also experienced 4. So they got attacked by, I think, France, Germany, UK, and Palestine, if I remember, actually committed critical attacks which would have damaged real infrastructure in China. And the one for Ireland, incidentally, so we had one critical attack against the honeypot we ran in Ireland, which is literally in my basement. That one is actually not my basement, my shed, so I don't have a basement. But that one was coming from China, from an IP address in Beijing, and that same machine also attacked our Russian honeypot several days later. So it's very interesting to see just who exactly is attacking people. And the fact is, it's not always the usual suspects. So what this showed us was, there's definitely, all this stuff about our Scada systems actually being attacked. The answer is 100% yes. So I know we only have a small snapshot here. We can see, what was affecting our honeypots. But I guarantee you, if you look at actual real Scada systems, this stuff is happening every single day. And before I finish up, there's one other attack I wanted to point out in particular. So our honeypot in America got a very, very highly targeted attack against it. we got a phishing email sent. So this phishing email claimed to be from the city administrator of the actual city where our honeypot was. So, and they did their homework. The actual city admin, they had the right name and so on. They faked an email to look like his email. This came with an attachment. So if you open the attachment, then it would infect the machine, right? So we built a system to look like a real admin system from a water plant, like a real laptop with like pictures of kids and wives and stuff, make it look realistic. We then opened up the document, which was a doc file. For anybody interested in vulnerabilities, it was CVE 2012-0158. Opening the doc had nothing really in it, but of course it would drop malware onto the machine, so which displayed a small pop-up and then basically went off and did stuff. Now we thought, excellent, we're an antivirus company, so we love when malware gets dropped and stuff, because that is much more interesting for me to look at than lots and lots of Modbus traffic all day long. So the malware splits in two. It has a component called gh.exe, which simply pulls all the passwords off the machine, for as Gadi talked about before, for hash type attacks to move laterally around the network. And then ai.exe, which was a bit more interesting, it essentially shovels a command shell back out to a command and control server, actually two of them, one in China and one in the US. And what would then happen, even though these are both very simple, is a day later, the attackers would download a more fully featured remote administration Trojan onto the machine. So over the 5 days that they were in our system, they stole passwords, they did full network analysis, they took over the entire fake network that we had built for this, exfiltrated VPN config files, exfiltrated sensitive documents, which are all faked. So really interesting stuff, and completely disabled all the antivirus and firewalls and security and so on, and a lot of anti-forensics stuff going on as well. But what was most interesting about this ai.exe, when you analyze that malware file, is it has a string in it, which you can see up here, so it's a string of text with the word hackspace or hackspace. That correlates to a malware, which is known as hackspace, so is the name given to it. And that malware showed up in the Mandiant APT1 report, which came out last year. And this is Mandiant's report tracing target attacks back to, in this case, a unit in the People's Liberation Army in China, which of course, that's Mandiant's word for it, that's their research, but very interesting to see that we've got links from the malware that affected us back to this group. So to conclude, I'm not going to go into details here on how you secure ICS systems. That could be an entire talk in itself, but in our papers that are around this research, we've got some advice that's in there from people who know what they're talking about. But what is definitely clear is that ICS systems are pretty trivial for attackers to find. They are being actively attacked by both possibly state level and also just by opportunistic attackers. And of course, it's in our best interest as a country and as an industry to help secure these types of devices. So I personally strongly believe that we should be, within our industry, actively probing and looking at the devices that are in Ireland, using Shodan and so on, seeing where they are, trying to lock them down and so on. And just to conclude, don't worry, I will disable that alert from killing people in the fake water plant in Thailand before I finish it. So that's it. Questions? James.
Hi. Based on the initial compromises in your honeypots, do you reckon they're starting out with automated scans, or is it being driven manually, like from the user agent sort of thing?
So what we saw is a lot of the attacks actually came through Shodan. So we see that the device is in Shodan. So they would start with Shodan or sometimes Google hacking. What they would then do is pretty good reconnaissance. So it wasn't just like in-map scan, the thing. The people who were attacking us were like using Modbus vulnerabilities and so on. So they really understood ICS systems. It wasn't just some kid with Metasploit. And then they would move laterally in the kind of classic APT ways, pass the hash. And a lot of the tools for moving laterally, and in our case, were all Chinese tools for that target attack.
So you reckon it was a dedicated human?
Yes, 100% dedicated, a team from the looks of things. Because we found as well the timing was always interesting for the different countries, that people come online at a certain time every day. So it's their 9-to-5 job, come in and hack things. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
You think there's one of the, I don't know what type plants would use Scada VR?
Yeah, you'd be surprised. So it's very common because it's free. and it's pretty well supported. So that's like, the reason we use that is because that's what the guys in the US they came up against that the whole time when they were in the ICS cert. So we use
So
that.
it will have nothing to do with water shortage,
Might have. Put it this way, that definitely wasn't me. So somebody else.
so you say.
Yeah, so I say, yeah, exactly. I'm also not responsible for the temperature in this room either. Yep.
Facilities such as nuclear plants, do they have different systems or similar?
They've different systems. I mean, they use slightly different PLCs and so on. The setup is going to be very similar to what I showed, you know, the data historians and so on. They take security a little bit better than water plants or gas plants in general because I guess, you know, nuclear tends to be very paranoid. But there is still all sorts of issues with them. And you still do have, you know, IT admins who just want to be able to remotely access their nuclear power plant to fix things occasionally. So you have that stuff just as much. Because it's just human nature. It's security isn't like everyone in this room knows security and is interested in security, but that isn't filtered really into that world, into the ICS world so much these days. Or it's starting to. Yep.
Is there much air gapping in Scada systems?
There's some air gapping, but realistically, it doesn't really work anymore because you've got SCADA systems deployed all over, you know, a country or a big area. So realistically, you do need remote access to them, and for that reason, there's not as much air gapping as there used to be. So it's not. It sounds like the simple solution, you know, air gap the system, don't let USB keys near it, and so on. But in reality, it just doesn't work. It doesn't fit the business needs of the organization. Keep going. Anything else? Going once, twice. Thanks very much.